Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen-Wertel with the great pleasure and honor of being the president of the Urban Institute and also of thanking you for joining us. The organizers and I are really excited to welcome both our external guests and also many of the Urban Institute's own team to this conversation, which I'm proud to co-host with Urban's Disability Affinity Group and is part of our internal discussion series, the Equity Dialogues. First, let me do a few housekeeping matters. This event is being recorded. The recording and relevant links will be posted online after the event. Live captions are turned on. So to turn off, visit the live transcription icon on the bottom of your screen. All participants are muted, and so please type your questions or comments into the question box at any time. We'll have time to answer some of those questions later. We'll get to as many as we can. And if you want to join the conversation online with other observers and participants on Twitter, use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So today we are so lucky to have lifelong international disability rights activist Judy Heumann with us today. For those of you who know her work, you know what an extraordinary leader she is and what a big deal it is for us to have her with us. A little over 3 decades ago, after decades of advocacy, so long in coming, the Americans with Disabilities Act became law, thanks to tireless efforts of Judy and many others. In 31 years, the US has made strides to become more accessible. And I was reminded this last weekend how far we have come, but also we also know how for so many institutions, people and infrastructure still fall short. So much more work is needed to ensure equal rights and opportunities for people with disabilities all around the world. Now, this past year has forced many organizations, including Urban, to think hard about advancing equity and inclusion, not only through the work we do, which is providing evidence-based research and data to help support better decision-making by so many different parts of society, but also through the workplace that we foster. We want to create a place where all staff feel they are equitably treated, they are valued and included in our work and community, regardless of their identity, experience, disability, or role. And we're just beginning to seriously explore what it means for Urban to better integrate disability inclusion into all of its work. How can we be elevating the voices of people with lived experience through greater outreach to the disability community and maybe even to understanding and allowing people with silent disabilities to share them in our own workplace? By disaggregating data by disability in ways that we're using our new data science techniques to do in racial equity, how do we think about that work in the disability space, and much, much more. There's lots we have to learn. To start us on this journey and also to share more broadly the importance of disability inclusion as we're so rightly focused as a society right now on inequities, we're really grateful to have Judy's voice here today. So let me briefly share just a bit about her background. Paralyzed with polio before her second birthday, Judy fought first to attend grade school. She was denied a teacher's license because of her paralysis in New York City, but eventually won her lawsuit against the city school system. She was one of the leaders of the Section 504 sit-ins, where she and other activists spent 28 days in the HEW regional office in San Francisco, eventually successfully pressuring the Carter administration and Joe Califano in particular to implement protections for disabled people's rights. This activism, I think, still represents the longest takeover of a government building, and it helped to build national movement and national attention to the issues that led to the creation of the ADA. Now, I have a huge treat for you if you have not already seen it. There is the Oscar-nominated documentary Crip Camp, which tells the story I was just telling. And I really encourage watching it. I watched it over the weekend on an Amtrak train, crying alternately with joy and sadness at these extraordinary history and stories, and particularly of Judy's remarkable ability to make sure that not only she is seen, but to make sure that others are seen too. And I don't recommend crying while wearing a mask on a train. It gets very messy and people look at you funny, but it was worth it. It's really an amazing, amazing film. And I congratulate it on its Oscar nomination. So I want to thank Judy for making the time to be with us. And I want to thank Urban's Disability Affinity Group for hosting today's dialogue. And I'm going to be joined here on this screen in just a second by Sue Popkin and Nora Hakazimana, and I really want to thank them for leading this discussion. Sue is an Institute Fellow and the Director of the Housing Opportunities and Services Together, or HOST initiative. And Nora is a research analyst in the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy. And I'm really grateful to them for the idea and inspiration and joining Judy here today. Please welcome Judy, Sue, and Nora. And thanks everyone for being here.
You would think unmuting myself would get easier as time goes, but here we are. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that beautiful introduction of our guest speaker today. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today. As part of the Equity Dialogue series here at Urban, we're very delighted to have this conversation about how disability intersects with social justice. Disability is a natural part of the human experience. Almost 1 in 5 people in the US have disabilities. Disability can be apparent, such as a mobility disability that causes someone to use a wheelchair, but many disabilities are invisible, including chronic illness and mental health disabilities. Disabilities can be lifelong or acquired, and the disability community is the only minority group that anyone can join at any time. Race and disability are inextricably linked. Disability disproportionately affects people of color, and people of color with disabilities are the most likely to live in poverty, be unemployed, and as we've seen in the pandemic, experience adverse health consequences.
My turn to do the same thing. Thanks, Nora. We are delighted today. I'll just add our thanks to Judy Heumann for coming to have a conversation with us about the history and the future of the disability rights movement. We're hoping that today's conversation will challenge us to examine how applying a disability lens is critical to achieving equality. Judy is truly an icon of the disability rights movement, as Sarah was telling you. I just wanted to call attention to a recent Washington Post article. I think they said it best when they called her the mother of the disability rights movement and a badass. Judy, welcome. It is such an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I just want to start where Sarah left off, really. Have you just tell us a bit about how you got involved with this, how you became a social justice leader? You've been fighting for the rights of people with disabilities since you were a kid. And can you talk a little bit about that experience and how you got to where you are now?
Well, it's a question that people frequently ask. And, you know, it's something that I never planned. It was really necessary for my parents. And then for me, and I think you see this mirrored in families all around the world, for those of us who had our disabilities either at birth or when we were younger. Certainly when I was growing up, there were no laws in place. So, you know, my parents are German Jewish immigrants. They lost their parents who were murdered in concentration camps. My mother was an only child who was sent to live with a distant relative in Illinois, and my father was sent to live with family in Brooklyn. And they met in 1945. My mother was visiting a relative, and my father's brother lived on the same block. And so it wasn't a formally arranged marriage, but that's how they met. They did all their communication via letters, including proposing and my mother accepting. And then my dad went out and visited this relative who I never met because she had died when I was less than 5. And they were just moving forward. My dad was in the military during the war. And all of this, I think, is relevant to this discussion because they were moving forward with their lives like so many people. And then when I had polio, my mother was pregnant with my brother. She was 8 months pregnant. You know, you can't plan for certain things. And so I was in and out of the hospital for, you know, a while. And my parents just had decided that, in spite of the fact that a doctor had recommended that I be institutionalized, that they were not going to do that. So they were raising me like my brother and later my other brother. And at 5 years old, you took your kid to school. So my mother took me to school, pulled my wheelchair up the steps, and was informed by the principal that I was a fire hazard. So, you know, what would a young mother, how would they even respond to something like that? And I think that was really, I don't know, it was the first, but it certainly was one of the major first things that my parents had to try to figure out how to deal with it. And there were many advocacy areas that my dad had a store, butcher store, so he like supported my mother and came to some of the meetings, but it really was my mother who was the activist. And when I finally did get into school, when I was in the middle of the 4th grade, that's when when I was meeting other disabled people. And likewise, my mother was meeting other mothers who had disabled kids. And at that time in New York City, if you used a wheelchair and couldn't walk up and down stairs, you were sent back on home instruction when you were supposed to go to high school. So my mother and other mothers worked on this and were able to get the Board of Ed to make some schools accessible. So then I was the first disabled student in this program that I went to ever go to high school. So these kinds of firsts that never should have been firsts. And I think gradually, one of the reasons why I do hope people watch Crip Camp, because I think Crip Camp really gives you a great example of the value, not just of disabled people, but the film is talking about disabled people, but I think it's the value of groups coming together, whether it's women or Black women or Latino women or any one of a gazillion themes that you could pick. In many cases, that ability to come together, to become friends with each other, to be able to really have meaningful discussions about the good, the bad, and things that could be done differently. I really think that's a lot of Crip Camp. It was, you know, for those of you who've gone to camp and went back for more than 1 year to the same camp, you made friends and you saw them again the following summer. Maybe you stayed in touch with them during the year. And certainly Camp Jeanette was very much like that. A number of us went to these special classes together and then went to camp together. But then as we were moving into high school, and that was one of the outcomes of the parents, is that high schools were now accessible in not every school, but some schools. So more of us were moving on to regular high schools. And why that was important was we were also moving from segregated classes where we were the only disabled kids, or only disabled kids were in those classes. And those classes were somewhat racially integrated. And the staff were also racially integrated. But that's where we really began to have more meaningful discussions about what the problems were, what we wanted to do, and to really begin to scheme about the changes that needed to be made. And so I think, like many of my friends, it's I have always felt since I was young that it wasn't just me, but it was other people that I was working with. And while we've made important progress, we, as everybody knows, we're not yet where we need to be. So for me, it's kind of been inevitable that I continue to work in the area of disability, not exclusively, because I think it's very important that we're looking at the inclusion of disabled people across our issues outside of the disability community. So that organizations like Urban can really be doing a job which meaningfully is integrating disability into the professional work that you're doing, as well as in the employment, retention, and advancement of staff.
I definitely want to talk about that too, but I wanted to ask you, I'm glad you brought us up to now. I wanted to talk about a recent the article in the Washington Post about something that really struck me as a person who started with an invisible disability that has now become visible. And you were talking to Trevor Noah, who's the host of The Daily Show. And he said he felt threatened when you said that everyone will likely experience disability at some point in their lives. And why do you think the idea of disability makes people feel threatened?
Well, it's really a funny piece, and you can look it up, March 4th, 2020.
I watched it.
I think there's two parts. There's the 10-minute interview that we did, and then they take about 3 or 4 minutes and put it into the film. But the point that Sue is making is he used the word able-bodied. And I don't use the word able-bodied. I have a thing about non-disabled people telling me that they're able and presuming I'm not. Because we're not all able to do everything. And yeah, anyway, so he used the word able-bodied, and I kind of tentatively came forth and said, well, statistically, you're going to acquire a temporary or permanent disability. And he says to me, are you threatening me? And everybody's laughing. And you can see on my face that there's this kind of moment of shock with the word. But I think Trevor Noah is amazing. So what I'm saying is not at all critical. I think it was unintentionally brilliant that he came up with the word, which I feel many people think about disability. People feel threatened because they feel vulnerable. People don't want to feel vulnerable. And in many ways, one of the reasons why I think work at Urban and other think tanks is so important is we want people to have an understanding of what needs to be done in order to remove the barriers, to end discrimination, to enable people with disabilities like ourselves today, or for those of you who will acquire temporarily or permanently a disability. I want people to understand that they're not just talking about somebody else, that they're talking about their mother, their father, their husband, their wife, their best friend, their children, their neighbor, and not looking at how to address things like transportation, housing, education, employment, and other issues that we really leave people in an abyss. Something happens and they don't know what to do. And there are lots of issues around that. But the bottom line is the word threaten, I thought, was really an appropriate word and really needs to be regularly unpacked, because we do need to understand what would prevent people from feeling threatened. And how do we empower people to recognize that they're part of this puzzle?
I think the flip side of that is it causes people with the disability to feel ashamed. I think it causes people who have the disability to feel shame.
Right.
I agree. We need to be figuring out how to have this conversation.
I think that word is really important. And again, one of the reasons why I feel that I was interested in participating today is because organizations need to recognize that failure to meaningfully include disability in its work, regardless of what it is, also makes people within the organization who have disabilities feel marginalized.
Mhm.
And I think shame, like the word threatened, is a very important word. And how people feel humiliated, embarrassed, depending on your background, that someone in your family did something wrong, the family's been cursed. And Urban does international work, and so these are issues that are very common outside of the US, but certainly inside the US too.
Nora, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, just staying on the subject of disability in the workplace, I think like many places, Urban is on a sort of a journey to do better on disability inclusion. And like most organizations, we're still in a learning process and it's not perfect. So can you talk about, I know you're kind of like touching on it right now around shame and the work that we do, but can you talk about the ways organizations like Urban can perpetuate ableism, whether it's intentionally or not, and how do we identify these policies and practices and to make sure, it's a more inclusive workplace?
Many of you may not have heard the word ableism. Ableism is a relatively new word, and I think you think about it in a similar way to racism and sexism and other forms of discrimination. I think the value of having a word attached is important because it means a number of things, including the fact that the community itself feels that there is a need to really have more in-depth discussions about how people are being denied equal opportunity, how people are being discriminated against. So in the case of Urban or other organizations, it really is important to do what you could call a deep house cleaning. Really be able to have more honest, open discussions around issues like recruitment, retention, advancement. See if there are people within the organization who in fact do have disabilities and have disclosed, and the benefit that it's been, because it should be a benefit or something which is at least neutral. It shouldn't be a negative.
Yeah.
Disclosing that you have a disability and may need an accommodation should not be a negative. It should be something that needs to be addressed because it's a presumption that you were hired because you've got the knowledge and capacity to enable the organization to flourish and grow. And I think in looking at issues around what enables an organization to flourish and grow, the issue of diversity is really important. And so enabling the organization itself to allow the people within the organization to recognize that this is an area where we know we haven't done enough work. We've been learning about that from staff who've been appropriately critical of what we haven't done. And we have a commitment to both addressing DEI, but also we have a commitment to looking at the day-to-day work that we're doing and how we are or are not including disability in the work that we are doing, and what it takes to be able to remove those barriers that make people feel like disability isn't relevant to their work, and rather help people understand how and why it is, and really over time being able to look at the impact of the work that you're doing on the research that you're doing, and how it can really help address issues of ableism and ultimately keeping disabled people marginalized in society with less ability to work and earn money.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, are you talking about like organizations creating the space for employees to self-disclose and how difficult that can be, and thinking about it from a personal perspective, as someone with an invisible disability, and as a young person with an invisible disability, and that transition from school to the workforce and how difficult that was, coming from an environment where they not only understood it, but there were systems in place. There was an office of disability to sort of like help you navigate, self-disclosure and ask for accommodations, and how much of an isolating experience it is transitioning to the workforce, where those same systems are not in place. And, feeling and having had friends who, were not lucky to be diagnosed as students, and have just like talking about how, being diagnosed as an adult, it's even more of an isolating experience, and going back to that sort of shame that you talked about. And that even though, disclosing, it's the right to disclose and ask for reasonable accommodations, disclosing a disability in the workplace is something, people fear, and I think still carries a lot of shame. And I just like wondering how that affects the work, our work together towards equity and inclusion. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. HR really needs to both understand what their obligations are under the law, and they need to make sure that hiring teams and hiring managers and day-to-day managers understand in a meaningful way the need to be able to speak with staff, allow people to know if they in fact have a disability and may need an accommodation, that it is something that Urban is willing to do in order to enable people to perform to their maximum. And I think the point that you were making about disclosure is very important. And, in too many institutions, what is not yet happening, and you really only find this out by staff maybe quietly mumbling with their friends. I needed this, but I didn't get it. I was made to feel blah, blah, blah. I had to do blah, blah, blah. And I assume those are some of the things that go on within an affinity group. From my perspective, HR needs to be following up more. They need to really be talking to the client, in this case, an employee, to find out how did the process go? How is it working? What recommendations does the individual have about how to make this an easier process in the future? I think training of staff is very important, so staff understand both what the obligations of the organization are as far as hiring, what questions can you ask and not ask. But equally importantly, it's important for the organization to be able to have a lens to the outside world, so that when people are looking at Urban, how do they know that Urban is an organization that not only seeks diversity, but is including disabled people in the diversity? So is it something which is visible in words, in pictures, in however, the organization advertises itself to the world? And then I think we need to make sure that, for example, when interviews are happening, that the prospective employee understands that if they need an accommodation for an interview, that is something the organization will do. And if the person is employed, accommodations are on the table for discussion. In other words, make people feel from the very beginning that they are valued for who they are,
Yeah.
and that there is an understanding that one's disability may need certain kinds of accommodations
Yeah.
in order to perform the job they're being recruited for, or the job that they're in, or
Yeah.
a non-disabled person who's working in the organization like Sue was discussing. I don't know, Sue, whether you had your disability when you first started working at Urban, or whether it was some.
I started working there when I was barely 23 years ago. So,
So it came on later.
mhm.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's an important culture change that needs to go on. So those coming in with disabilities and those acquiring disabilities, or those who have family members, like a child or, an adult, mother or
I'm
father.
also in that category.
Sure, the older we get, the more we are in those categories. Yeah, but I think that's really important that as the organization is changing, that the employees of the organization are engaged with the change and feel that what is being done is in the best interest of staff.
Mhm.
Exactly. It's hard to talk about disability rights without talking about the pandemic. So I would like to have you very briefly just say a few words about your thinking around the pandemic, how the pandemic has affected the disability community, and what should we all be thinking about as we look at the response to COVID, and whether that's from an unemployment lens, whether it's from a vaccine accessibility lens, or just as organizations start to talk about going back into the office.
Well, I'll give a little answer. We can't do it all, but for me, COVID demonstrates that our public health system in the United States is basically non-existent.
Hmm.
And I think that's a number one issue for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
The ability for people to trust what educators, healthcare people are saying about, in this case, COVID, and precautions that people should be taking, and how there is such a divide. Slowly, I hope people are logically looking at the fact that these are not political issues. They're really issues that are important to the stability of the family, of the community, of the country. When looking at COVID specifically around disability, I think there are many problems. One of them is we are not reporting on deaths around COVID, including disability.
Mhm.
So when you look at a number of things, one, the disability community has advocated for decades that institutionalization is detrimental to both the lives of those with disabilities living in the institution and to the staff.
Yeah.
And we certainly have seen this with COVID and nursing homes, and COVID in other restricted living environments where congregate living has impacted the spread, and where workers were not given appropriate protections. But I also want to say that the media really has not been reporting this from like their disability lens is mainly non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we should be discussing when we look at issues like disproportionate numbers of people in inner cities that are dying for multiple reasons, poverty being one of them, lack of appropriate healthcare previously, lack of appropriate medications, etc. But all these people have disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
They have diabetes, they have whatever it may be, hypertension, and not really discussing disability as a central part of this. I think also really doesn't allow the societies to think about some of the bigger issues we're discussing. So do you want in your plans a nursing home to be a place where you want to go? And if you don't, or you don't want it for a loved one, then you need to figure out why it's happening. And you need to figure out what can be done. And you need to understand how policies exist on a state to state level, as far as the ability to get personal assistance paid for by the government when your income level is whatever the state has decided it can be. But you need to see that you can be a change agent and that you need to be a part of this. And research on this really needs to be addressing this. You know, what do we know are the causes of people, in this case, going into nursing homes? What are we seeing as COVID hopefully is on the wane? But what are we going to be doing to ensure that we have policies in place so that we are reducing the number of people in these restricted living environments, and that people can live in the community and adequately contribute regardless of their age or disability?
That is a great segue to what we wanted to ask next, which is, you've talked a few times about how Urban is a policy research organization. And our mission is to provide facts and evidence to support policymaking. I think a question I have is, how can we partner with the disability community to support evidence-based policymaking to make policy on the kinds of issues you were just discussing?
I mean, I think there are multiple ways. And the way I would ask that question is, what other word could you put in there? So if you get out the word disability, do you say Black people, Latino, Indigenous, da, 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 da? And what are the answers? The answers are, you need to know people in the community. You need to be looking at ways of meaningfully engaging people. So obviously one way is to have people on staff, but another way is to possibly have advisory committees or sources in the community who are reliable, understand what groups like the National Council on Independent Living, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, the university affiliated networks, National Association of the Deaf, on and on. These types of organizations that really have large numbers of disabled people involved with them, who you can speak with. It's really not magic. It really is going to the source and, you know, being diverse in that. Really, disability, as we've been discussing, is one of the most diverse communities, because onset of disability is as you get older, more frequent. And also, I think because of that, people are really much less aware of what they can even benefit from. So there may be adverse things that are happening because one has acquired a disability, in part because you don't know the sources that you can go to help you do things like modify an apartment or a home. Where do you get durable medical equipment? If you've got a kid with a learning disability or dyslexia, what's out there? What is the school system's obligation? What is, you know, on and on.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And, you know, my experience as a parent, navigating the school system was quite a challenge, and having some guidance, having research on how to support people in doing that would definitely be useful. Nora?
Yeah, so this year marks 31 years since the passing of the ADA, which was a groundbreaking law made possible by you and the work of many activists over the course of many years. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on where do we go from here, when it comes to disability rights and inclusion. Just curious on what gives you hope today. I think for me, what gives me hope is that we're starting to realize and starting to have these, the conversation that showing up for racial justice and this movement, and the belief that this movement becomes more powerful when we center the leadership of people with disabilities, and when all of our organizing is informed by anti-ableism and access and disability justice. So Judy, just curious, what gives you hope today?
Well, what?
I'm curious on what gives you hope today.
Well, my hope today is that, like, narrowly speaking, that Urban is really committing to this. I know that the affinity group is. I really appreciate that Sarah came on, and what I really hope to see is some kind of a plan that will come out over the next number of months that really allows the organization to see that you're a learning organization and that you recognize more learning, teaching, inclusion needs to happen in order to make people, both people with disabilities who work within Urban, but also the external world, to understand and to, I mean, unfortunately, I think too frequently people don't value research. And I am a very strong believer in the value of research, but it doesn't become valuable or could be invaluable, I mean, not valuable if we don't see ourselves appropriately, we meaning disabled people, don't see ourselves appropriately in the work that's being done. And to the extent that people see that Urban is doing a good job of really kind of opening the onion and peeling and taking out all the layers, and is really looking at what it needs to do to appropriately be integrating disability into its work. I think that serves many purposes. One, obviously, is that the work of the organization becomes more relevant as it can really document barriers and successes that are being made as a result of laws and other things, and also allows the organization to really speak out as an organization of knowledge. So I think that's very important. But also where we are right now in the movement is things are changing. And in many ways, those changes are good. Because, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, even early 70s, our big cry was end discrimination. But as we learned, not only are we fighting to end discrimination and ableism, etc., but we are also wanting to ensure that we have the knowledge base. So in the beginning, I would talk about things like issues in disability were like going into a candy store. You could pick up any piece of candy and you knew that disability was not appropriately being addressed. But at some point, it became really important to be able to look at things like, okay, we want to say we want to get on the bus, but what do we need to do? What does it mean to make a bus accessible? We want kids integrated into school. What are effective methods of doing that? We want to look at dropout rates of disabled students in universities and high schools. How do we look at that in a meaningful way? We really needed to begin to get people who were studying in many, many different fields so that they not only could bring themselves forward as a disabled individual of color, of different sexual orientation, whatever, but they also would be able to really help contribute and lead in a meaningful way, if that makes sense. So when looking at employment, what are the barriers? What are we learning from staff? What are we learning from broader data sets. What is working? What is not working? What are methods that people need to be using that will help advance these issues more rapidly? What policy changes need to be made? And I think in the area of disability, for those of you working in that area, doing research in that area, that there are so many barriers that are built within the system that make it very difficult for some disabled people even to begin to work, or other people who acquire a disability to stay in the world of work.
Thank you so much. We have a number of questions that have popped in, so I want to make sure we have a few minutes for those. So do you want me to lead off, Nora?
I can go ahead. With the first question.
Okay.
So Judy, the first question from our attendees is that President Biden campaigned hard with people with disabilities, yet I have not seen people with disabilities appointed as judges or to high-level administration positions. What are your thoughts on this?
I think they have been hiring some disabled people. There's a good person who has not yet been confirmed over at the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the Department of Labor. And hopefully, now that she's had her hearing, she will get through clearance. Taryn Williams, who's a great disabled woman, worked in the White House, worked at the Department of Labor, African-American disabled woman with a hidden disability. To me, she is a great pick because she is smart, she knows the field, and she really speaks as an individual to so many groups. She's very smart, she's authentic. And I think it's those kinds of people that the administration is bringing in. I think they had a lot to deal with before, because of what was going on with the last administration. I, like you, do hope that we are going to see some more announcements quickly about people in senior positions, but I very much believe that the administration is committed to doing this. I think they've been that way since, most of the people who were running for the Democratic nomination did have position papers out on disability, which in and of itself was very unique. So you can see that the engagement of disabled people in electoral politics, in voting, is really advancing, and I think that's very important. And there was a committee working last summer for Biden that was looking at a whole host of issues, including making recommendations for names. So I presume in the next number of weeks, there'll be more names coming forward.
That's great. We have a lot of questions in only 10 minutes, so, and more are coming in. I guess I think this is an important issue that the administration will probably have to address. Can you comment on the requirement in many government disability programs that individuals not work to get or maintain benefits, and how that affects organizations like ours in navigating these waters, whether for research or for recruitment?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. It is something that I was alluding to a little bit ago. But I think really there are a number of things you have to remember. Many disabled people like myself have not been on benefits for many, many years. So there are people out there with degrees, advanced degrees, that certainly could be appropriate candidates for jobs. Go out there and find them. I found that when I was the assistant secretary at the Department of Ed and had a staff of about 400, one of the things I had to do was go beyond the typical disability community, really needed to go to the professional associations, many of which now have committees on disability that are looking at a whole host of issues like urban, allow these organizations to know that you're looking for people. I also think it's really important that the universities that you work with really understand that you are that in looking for greater diversity, you want to see that they are educating people with various forms of disabilities and other backgrounds that you can look at for interns or for hiring, for full-time staff positions. You need to get the message out there and look at how you've gotten the message out there on race and gender, and see if you're doing the same thing in the area of disability. The other point that I'd like to make is that there are people, I think, within Urban who understand the complexities of the Social Security system. And while they may not be the ones to talk with someone about what programs are available to allow people to move through these problems, you certainly will know people who can help people look at their financial situation and what they need to do to be able to move into the world of work, how you get on and off benefits. But I think it's a great question because you need to understand the issues that people are facing in order to be able to also look at opportunities for research. And in this area, there's been a lot of work that's been done. But what is the reason that we have not been able to make the systemic changes that need to happen so that a disabled person graduating from an Ivy League school or from a state university like Berkeley, that they're not afraid of going and getting a job because they're afraid that they'll lose their benefits. And I think that's really part of the point that you're raising. So I think it's a great issue.
Yeah. I really like this next question. Do disabled people have obligations and responsibilities or only rights?
Only rights. I'm sorry, I can't see your face. But of course we have obligations. And I'm not at all implying that we don't. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. What we're talking about is the desire to be able to fulfill these obligations. I mean, I think, many people see work as an essential part of our lives to support ourselves, to support our families, whatever it may be. And that people, in many ways, get enjoyment out of working. It's contributing, it's being a change agent, it's being many things. So I think, what is important to recognize is that, like any group, disabled individuals are no different. We may have different barriers that we have to address. But again, I think, Urban Institute is a really important organization to really investigate, look at some of the barriers that are persistent, that really, I think in many ways, disabled people are not learning about the intricacies of some of these programs and how you can, ticket to work and all these other things are not simple. And people need, people need to not feel afraid of losing critical benefits. And what people earn and what people potential for earning more money, all of that's very important. And I think we're really, in many ways, we're still at a very ground level, so that disabled people in elementary school and high school, at universities, really learn more about organizations like Urban and what you're doing to integrate disability, so that people out there can see this is the type of organization that can publicly speak about what it's doing on inclusion. And we're ready to fulfill our obligations.
So, hoping we can fit in one, that was a great answer. I am hoping we have time for one more, because I think it's important. What is the growing neurodivergent community added to the national conversation on disability and disability policy? Are there emerging lessons on fostering a more inclusive disability agenda that includes neurodiversity?
I mean, of course, the answer is yes. I think we need to see that there have been many communities that have been coming forward. Certainly neurodiverse people are an important part. And I think what's most important about the neurodiverse community is that they are in many ways reasonably organized and can really speak up on their own behalf and on the behalf of the group, both talking about contributions that people are able to make and are making, and the barriers that people are facing. So I think that, you can say the same for people with a whole host of different types of disabilities. The term neurodiversity is a relatively new term, as are many of the terms, but one of the important issues is that more people in these different categories are identifying in one way or another as a disabled individual. They may continue to use other terms that allow them to identify with a particular group, but ultimately, this is a large and growing community of people who are really saying enough is enough, and we're not waiting, we're coming forward, really demanding our rightful place and implementation of laws.
Do you have it? I don't think we have any time for any more, but thank you so much for coming today and being with us and engaging in this conversation. I think Urban Institute is just beginning on its journey.
Yes. Thank you so much, Judy. This has been such an honor and a privilege to be able to have this conversation with you. I feel like I can speak for many people saying that we learned so much, and yes, thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story, Nora.
Thank you.
All right, guys, hopefully I'll see you again.
Yes, we'll see you in a little while, actually.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Sarah.